Right, well, hello everyone. We're just going to have a look at sowing fern spores today. And I have to say that this is my method, but people do use different methods, and so I'll just quickly touch on those. I think it is important to understand how ferns reproduce when it comes to sowing spores. So this is actually on the British Pteridological Society website, and it's important to remember that spores are not the same as seeds. They've only got half the genetic component in sexually reproducing species, and after the spores are shed, they grow into a completely different plant. It's called the demystifies because it produces the gametes. It's also called the prothallus, and that starts off by producing male cells that swim, and at the front of the prothallus then there are female cells produced, and once they're fertilized they'll grow again into the fern that we recognize. So we have to make sure that the conditions are going to be suitable for the demystifies and also for the male cells to be able to swim. I think you might be able to see, which one was it? It was this one. There's a picture of demystifies in this leaflet. If you look at that on screen, you'll see much better. But there are some demystifies in here. Very easy to mistake for, to just have a look. This is not what it says on the tin of this plant, actually. And that often happens when you're growing spores, that you get an intruder that isn't what you intended. These little plants here are the demystifies, so they're really tiny. If you want to have a look at those. So, because they can be very easily swamped by moss, and we've all been there, and that's not what you want from your spore sowing. So what you have to try to do is make the compost quite sterile. Now people do this in various ways. There are various containers you can use for growing ferns in, and some people use takeaway trays, put some holes in the bottom, fill with compost, and often people then microwave that, but I have friends who have blown up their microwaves, so you don't know what's in the compost. If there's any bits of metal or whatever in there, it won't do your microwave any good. So that's not the method I use. I normally use a 3-inch pot because I'm only growing a few ferns, but if you wanted to grow hundreds, you can use a big tray and then use a propagator. So it's a very good idea to use gloves when you're handling compost because you don't know what's in there. So my method is to loosely fill the pot to the top, and then use one of the other pots to just push it down so you've got a nice firm surface just about where the rim of the pot is. I use boiling water to sterilize it, but if you were to just pour the boiling water onto that, it would make holes in the compost. 'So, if you, cut up your kitchen roll into squares like that, and then this kettle isn't boiling, but you boil up your kettle, okay, and just sort of flood the top with the boiling water. Then is quite a good time to pop it into what should be a labelled plastic bag, so you can write with an indelible marker onto your plastic bag the spores that you're going to plant in there. I don't know if it's just superstition, but I like to do the boiling water treatment 3 times, so that anything that's germinated after the first lot I get on the second lot of boiling water, and then I usually leave it overnight and do it again. Obviously in this demonstration we can't wait for the boiling water to have cooled down, so imagine that was done yesterday. Maybe. So you've got your sterilised compost in a sealed bag. When you come to sow your spores, I can't do this wearing gloves certainly, the spores that come from our Pteridological Society spore exchange come in little foil packets like that. To get into them, undo the ends, and then it will unfold once, and then you need to find where it unfolds again. It helps if you have quite small fingers to do this. Now, when you look in with a lot of the packets, you might go, ooh, there's nothing there. In here, I can just see that there's a collection of sort of brown powder in the bottom there. Okay, but there are thousands of spores in that, and one of the problems when you're sowing is that you can't see how many spores you've put on, so it is all a bit of an act of faith. So when you come to this stage, you can open your sterilised pot, take off the paper, and that should take off any remaining spores or things you don't want. And then if you can't really see anything on there, then I just turn the whole thing upside down and give it a flick, and hope that I won't have put too many spores on. But with something like this, I'll probably just sort of tap like that around the pot. There's still spores in there. I might put those back in the fridge in case nothing comes up the first time. And then seal that up and put it on a windowsill that doesn't get baking sun. But they do need light to germinate, and quite a lot of growers I know use grow lights with 8-hour darkness and 16-hour light to get them to germinate. And in my experience, that does work quite well. Some spores will germinate inside 6 weeks, really quick, but the longest I think I ever hung onto a pot was 5 years, and then I did actually get some germination and some nice plants from it. So as long as you keep this compost nice and moist, so every time you open the packet you do run the risk of getting more contamination in, and what I do is have a spray and I'll put boiled water into it and obviously let it cool down, and then if I think that the packet's getting a bit dried out, I'll open it quickly and spray it. If the gametophytes are very crowded, they can sometimes inhibit each other from making the new sporophytes, and so some people at that stage, when they've got their gametophytes, will patch them out onto compost or plug trays or whatever. I tend not to do that, but it is an option. Then once you've got to the stage of little sporophytes appearing, and this was sown February last year, so it's just a year, and here you can actually still see gametophytes, but you can see the little sporophytes coming. Okay, now some people patch them out into plug trays. Again, it's probably best to sterilise the compost, but you know, the sort of plastic plug trays that have like 5 cells by 20, I think it is. So you can grow on quite a lot of them like that, and then once they get to be reasonable sized plants, you can just pop them into a 3-inch pot. You can't just put these into the open air because they've been in this confined space and they're not very good at conserving water, so they can soon dry out. If they go into plug trays, you can put a propagator lid on. And the other way that a lot of people do is they can, if you just prick holes in the plastic bag gradually and increase the amount of ventilation that it gets over the period of hardening off. There is a bit of trial and error in all of this, and unfortunately it's the stage when a lot of the plants don't quite make it because it's hard to get them out of the plastic bag into the air. Once you've got them potted on, and I think that probably the spring, when things are actively growing, is a good time to plant them into bigger pots. It will probably then, depending on what it is, it may be a year or two before it's big enough to actually plant out in the garden. So you have to be a bit careful of not putting them out too soon. But if you're growing house plants, once they're out of their plastic bags, they're probably good to go. Okay, are there any questions? No questions. Thank you very much.